Hello, continuing to read from the text, Communication in the Real World, An Introduction to Communication Studies. This is Chapter 8, Section 2, Exploring Specific Cultural Identities. Learning Objectives. Define the social constructionist view of culture and identity. Trace the historical development and construction of the four cultural identities discussed. Discussed how each of the four cultural identities discussed affects and/or relates to communication. We can get a better understanding of current cultural identities by unpacking how they came to be. By looking at history, we can see how cultural identities that seem to have existed forever actually came to be constructed for various political and social reasons, and how they have changed over time. Communication plays a central role in this construction. As we have already discussed, our identities are relational and communicative. They are also constructed. Social constructionism is a view that argues the self is formed through our interactions with others and in relationship to social, cultural, and political contexts. In this section, we'll explore how the cultural identities of race, gender, sexual orientation, and ability have been constructed in the United States and how communication relates to those identities. There are other important identities that could be discussed, like religion, age, nationality, and class. Although they are not given their own section, consider how those identities may intersect with the identities discussed next. Race. Would it surprise you to know that human beings, regardless of how they are racially classified, share 99.9% of their DNA? This finding by the Human Genome Project asserts that race is a social construct, not a biological one. The American Anthropological Association agrees, stating that race is the product of historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances. Therefore, we'll define race as a socially constructed category based on differences in appearance that has been used to create hierarchies that privilege some and disadvantage others. Race didn't become a socially and culturally recognized marker until European colonial expansion in the 1500s. As Western Europeans traveled to parts of the world previously unknown to them and encountered people who were different from them, a hierarchy of races began to develop that placed lighter-skinned Europeans above darker-skinned people. At the time, newly developing fields in natural and biological sciences took interest in examining the new locales, including the plant and animal life, natural resources, and native populations. Over the next 300 years, science that we would now undoubtedly recognize as flawed, biased, and racist legitimated notions that native populations were less evolved than white Europeans, often calling them savages. In fact, there were scientific debates as to whether some of the native populations should be considered human or animal. Racial distinctions have been based largely on phenotypes, or physiological features such as skin color, hair texture, and body facial features. Western scientists use these differences as proof that native populations were less evolved than the Europeans, which helped justify colonial expansion, enslavement, genocide, and exploitation on massive scales. Even though there is a consensus among experts that race is a social rather than biological construct, we can't deny that race still has meaning in our society and affects people as if it were real. Given that race is one of the first things we notice about someone, it's important to know how race and communication relate. Discussing race in the United States is difficult for many reasons. One is due to uncertainty about language use. People may be frustrated by their perception that labels change too often or be afraid of using an improper term and being viewed as racially insensitive. It is important, however, that we not let political correctness get in the way of meaningful dialogues and learning opportunities related to difference. Learning some of the communicative history of race can make us more competent communicators and open us up to more learning experiences. Racial classifications used by the government and our regular communication about race in the United States have changed frequently, which further points to the social construction of race. Currently, the primary racial groups in the United States are African Americans, Asian American, European American, Latino, and Native American, but a brief look at changes in how the U.S. Census Bureau has defined race clearly shows that this hasn't always been the case. In the 1900s alone, there were about 26 different ways that race was categorized on census forms. The way we communicate about race in our regular interactions has also changed, and many people are still hesitant to discuss race for fear of using the wrong vocabulary. There's a chart here, and I'll take a quick look at the chart. So it goes by year and then development. 1790, no categories for race. 1800s, race was defined by the percentage of African blood. Mulatto was 1 black and 1 white parent. Quadroon was 1/4 African blood, and octoroon was 1/8. 1830 to 1940, the term color was used instead of race. 1900, racial categories included white, black, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. I'm guessing that means East Indian, but I'm not sure. Census takers were required to check one of these boxes based on visual cues. Maybe this is for the US and it means Native Americans. Individuals did not get to select a racial classification on their own until 1970. 1950, the term color was dropped and replaced by race. 1960, 1970, both race and color were used on census forms. 1980 to 2010, race again became the only term on census forms. 2000, individuals were allowed to choose more than one racial category for the first time in U.S. Census history. 2010, the census included 15 racial categories and an option to write in races not listed on the form. The 5 primary racial groups noted previously can still be broken down further to specify a particular region, country, or nation. For example, Asian Americans are diverse in terms of country and language of origin and cultural practices. While the category of Asian Americans can be useful when discussing broad trends, it can also generalize among groups, which can lead to stereotypes. You may find that someone identifies as Chinese American or Korean American instead of Asian American. In this case, the label further highlights a person's cultural lineage. We should not assume, however, that someone identifies with his or her cultural lineage, as many people have more in common with their U.S. peers than a culture that may be one or more generations removed. History and personal preference also influence how we communicate about race. Culture and communication scholar Brenda Allen notes that when she was born in 1950, her birth certificate included an N for Negro. Later, she referred to herself as colored because that's what people in her community referred to themselves as. During and before this time, the term black had negative connotations and would likely have offended someone. There was a movement in the 1960s to reclaim the word black, and the slogan "Black is Beautiful" was commonly used. Brenda Allen acknowledges the newer label of African American, but notes that she still prefers black. The terms colored and Negro are no longer considered appropriate because they were commonly used during a time when black people were blatantly discriminated against. Even though that history may seem far removed to some, it is not to others. Currently, the term African American and Black are frequently used, and both are considered acceptable. The phrase people of color is acceptable for most and is used to be inclusive of other racial minorities. If you are unsure what to use, you could always observe how a person refers to him or herself, or you could ask for his or her preference. In any case, a competent communicator defers to and respects the preference of the individual. The label Latin American generally refers to people who live in Central American countries, although Spain colonized much of what is now South and Central America and parts of the Caribbean. The inhabitants of these areas are now much more diverse. Depending on the region or country, some people primarily trace their lineage or to the indigenous people who lived in these areas before colonization, or to a Spanish and indigenous lineage, or to other combinations that may include European, African, and/or indigenous heritage. Latina and Latino are labels that are preferable to Hispanic for many who live in the United States and trace their lineage to South and/or Central America and/or parts of the Caribbean. Scholars who study Latino identity often use the label Latina or Latino in their writing to acknowledge women who avow that identity label. In verbal communication, you might say Latina when referring to a particular female, or Latino when referring to a particular male of Latin American heritage. When referring to the group as a whole, you could say Latinas and Latinos instead of just Latinos, which would be more gender inclusive. While Hispanic is used by the U.S. Census, it refers primarily to people of Spanish origin, which doesn't account for the diversity of background of many Latinos. The term Hispanic also highlights the colonizers' influence over the indigenous, which erases a history that is important to many. Additionally, there are people who claim Spanish origins and identify culturally as Hispanic, but racially as white. If I'm not mistaken, by the way, I believe the old maps and the old term for Spain was Hispania. So I think that's where the term Hispanic comes from. Labels such as Puerto Rican or Mexican American, which further specify region or country of origin, may also be used. Just as with other cultural groups, if you are unsure of how to refer to someone, you can always ask for and honor someone's preference. I think it's interesting that they don't say anything about the roots of the term white or Caucasian, because I personally, being a white person, don't even know on the planet where the Caucasoid region was, but I think it's somewhere in the area of where Russia is now, and that's where the term Caucasoid or Caucasian came from. And I don't particularly think of myself as white. My skin's not white, just like black people's skin is not black. So it's interesting they're leaving whites out of this and just assuming this. The history of immigration in the United States also ties to the way that race has been constructed. The metaphor of the melting pot has been used to describe the immigration history of the United States, but doesn't capture the experiences of many immigrant groups. Generally, immigrant groups who were white or light-skinned and spoke English were better able to assimilate or melt into the melting pot. But immigrant groups that we might think of as white today were not always considered so. Irish immigrants were discriminated against and even portrayed as black in cartoons that appeared in newspapers. In some southern states, Italian immigrants were forced to go to black schools, and it wasn't until 1952 that Asian immigrants were allowed to become citizens of the United States. All this history is important because it continues to influence communication among races today. Interracial communication. Race and communication are related in various ways. Racism influences our communication about race and is not an easy topic for most people to discuss. Today, people tend to view racism as overt acts, such as calling someone a derogatory name or discriminating against someone in thought or action. However, there is a difference between racist acts, which we can attach to an individual, and institutional racism, which is not as easily identifiable. It is much easier for people to recognize and decry racist actions than it is to realize that racist patterns and practices go through societal institutions, which means that racism exists and doesn't have to be committed by any one person. As competent communicators and critical thinkers, we must challenge ourselves to be aware of how racism influences our communication at an individual and societal level. We tend to make assumptions about people's race based on how they talk, and often these assumptions are based on stereotypes. Dominant groups tend to define what is correct or incorrect usage of a language. And since language is so closely tied to identity, labeling a group's use of a language as incorrect or deviant challenges or negates part of their identity. We know there isn't only one way to speak English, but there have been movements to identify a standard. This becomes problematic when we realize that standard English refers to a way of speaking English that is based on white, middle-class ideals that do not match up with the experiences of many. I disagree with that because white middle-class English is determined by the wealthy classes who had control over the official legal language in legal documents. Anyway, differences between standard English and what has been called Black English have gotten national attention through debates about whether or not instruction in classrooms should accommodate students who do not speak standard English. Education plays an important role in language acquisition, and class relates to access to education. In general, whether someone speaks standard English themselves or not, they tend to negatively judge people whose speech deviates from the standard. Just as an aside, many of you may not know that it is illegal to give a so-called Black or African American student in the public school system an IQ test. Even if the parents are both Black and request the IQ test, it's illegal to give IQ tests to Black students in the schools because it's been considered discrimination for something like 40 years. Another national controversy has revolved around the inclusion of Spanish in common language use, such as Spanish as an option at ATMs or other automated services, and Spanish language instruction in school for students who don't speak or are learning to speak English. As was noted earlier, the Latina population in the United States is growing fast, which has necessitated inclusion of Spanish in many areas of public life. This has also created a backlash, which some scholars argue is tied more to the race of the immigrants than the language they speak, and a fear that white America could be engulfed by other languages and cultures. This backlash has led to a revived movement to make English the official language of the United States. As somebody who worked in school systems for 15 years, it's really difficult when you have kids who come to your school and they don't speak English and nobody in the school speaks their dialect, and we're trying to teach them English because we need a standard language that we can teach in and test in and hold people accountable for. We can't have all of our teachers being not only bilingual, but multilingual in every language. So from a point of view of just being practical, imagine how difficult it would be if you accommodated every single language and dialect of the world on a stop sign. It would be very, very difficult. Anyway, the U.S. Constitution does not stipulate a national language, and Congress has not designated one either. While nearly 30 states have passed English language legislation, it has mostly been symbolic, and court rulings have limited any enforceability. The Linguistic Society of America points out that immigrants are very aware of the social and economic advantages of learning English and do not need to be forced. They also point out that the United States has always had many languages represented, that national unity hasn't rested on a single language, and that there are actually benefits to having a population that is multilingual. Interracial communication presents some additional verbal challenges. Code switching involves changing from one way of speaking to another between or within interactions. Some people of color may engage in code switching when communicating with dominant group members because they fear they will be negatively judged. Adopting the language practices of the dominant group may minimize perceived differences. This code switching creates a linguistic dual consciousness in which people are able to maintain their linguistic identities within their in-group peers, but can still acquire tools and gain access needed to function in dominant society. White people may also feel anxious about communicating with people of color out of fear of being perceived as racist. In other situations, people in dominant groups may spotlight non-dominant members by asking them to comment on or educate others about their race. For example, I once taught at a private university that was predominantly white. Students of color talked to me about being asked by professors to weigh in on an issue when discussions of race came up in the classroom. While a professor may have been well-intentioned, spotlighting can make a student feel conspicuous, frustrated, or defensive. Additionally, I bet the professors wouldn't think about asking a white, male, or heterosexual student to give their perspective to the group. Gender. When we first meet a newborn baby, we ask whether it's a girl or boy. This question illustrates the importance of gender in organizing our social lives and our interpersonal relationships. A Canadian family became aware of the deep emotions people feel about gender and the great discomfort people feel when they can't determine gender when they announce to the world that they were not going to tell anyone the gender of their baby aside from the baby's siblings. Their desire for their child, named Storm, to be able to experience early life without the boundaries and categories of gender brought criticisms from many. Conversely, many parents consciously or unconsciously code their newborns in gendered ways based on our society's associations of pink clothing and accessories with girls and blue with boys. While it's obvious to most people that colors aren't gendered, they take on new meaning when we assign gendered characteristics of masculinity and femininity to them. Just like race, gender is socially constructed. While it is true that there are biological differences between who we label male and female, the meaning our society places on those differences is what actually matters in our day-to-day lives. And the biological differences are interpreted differently around the world, which further shows that although we think gender is a natural, normal, stable way of classifying things, it is actually not. There is a long history of appreciation for people who cross gender lines in Native American and South Central Asian cultures, to name just two. You may have noticed that I use the word gender instead of sex. That's because gender is an identity based on internalized cultural notions of masculinity and femininity that is constructed through communication and interaction. There are two important parts of this definition to unpack. First, we internalize notions of gender based on socializing institutions, which helps us form our gender identity. Then, we attempt to construct that gendered identity through our interactions with others, which is our gender expression. Sex is based on biological characteristics, including external genitalia, internal sex organs, chromosomes, and hormones. While the biological characteristics between men and women are obviously different, It's the meaning that we create and attach to those characteristics that makes them significant. The cultural differences in how that significance is ascribed are proof that our way of doing things is arbitrary. For example, cross-cultural research has found that boys and girls in most cultures show both aggressive and nurturing tendencies, but cultures vary in terms of how they encourage these characteristics between genders. In a group in Africa, young boys are responsible for taking care of babies and are encouraged to be nurturing. Gender has been constructed over the past few centuries in political and deliberate ways that have tended to favor men in terms of power, and various academic fields joined in the quest to prove there are natural differences between men and women. While the proof they presented was credible to many at the time, it seems blatantly sexist and inaccurate today. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, scientists who measure skulls, also known as craniometrists, claimed that men were more intelligent than women because they had larger brains. Leaders in the fast-growing fields of sociology and psychology argued that women were less evolved than men and had more in common with children and savages than an adult white male. Doctors and other decision makers, like politicians, also used women's menstrual cycles as evidence that they were irrational or hysterical and therefore couldn't be trusted to vote, pursue higher education, or be in a leadership position. These are just a few of the many instances of how knowledge was created by seemingly legitimate scientific disciplines that we can now clearly see serve to empower men and disempower women. This system is based on the ideology of patriarchy, which is a system of social structures and practices that maintains the values, priorities, and interests of men as a group. One of the ways patriarchy is maintained is by its relative invisibility. While women have been the focus of much research on gender differences, males have been largely unexamined. Men have been treated as the generic human being to which others are compared. But that ignores that fact that men have a gender too. Masculinity studies have challenged that notion by examining how masculinities are performed. There have been challenges to the construction of gender in recent decades. Since the 1960s, scholars and activists have challenged established notions of what it means to be a man or a woman. The women's rights movement in the United States dates back to the 1800s, when the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Although most women's rights movements have been led by white middle-class women, there was overlap between those involved in the abolitionist movement to end slavery, and that word, abolitionist, is rooted in the root there, abolish, to end slavery, and the beginnings of the women's rights movement. Although some of the leaders in the early women's rights movement had class and education privilege, they were still taking a risk by organizing and protesting. Black women were even more at risk, and Sojourner Truth, an emancipated slave, faced those risks often and gave a much-noted extemporaneous speech at a women's rights gathering in Akron, Ohio in 1851, which came to be called Ain't I a Woman? Her speech highlighted the multiple layers of oppression faced by Black women. You can watch actress Alfre Woodard deliver an interpretation of the speech in video clip 8.1. And there's a link here to the speech, which is on YouTube. Feminism, as an intellectual and social movement, advanced women's rights and our overall understanding of gender. Feminism has gotten a bad reputation based on how it has been portrayed in the media and by some politicians. When I teach courses about gender, I often ask my students to raise their hand if they consider themselves feminists. I usually only have a few, if any, who do. I found that students I teach are hesitant to identify as a feminist because of connotations of the word. However, when I ask students to raise their hand if they believe women have been treated unfairly and that there should be more equity, most students raise their hand. Gender and communication scholar Julia Wood has found the same trend and explains that a desire to make a more equitable society for everyone is at the root of feminism. She shares comments from a student that capture this disconnect. Quote, "I would never call myself a feminist because that word has so many negative connotations. I don't hate men or anything, and I'm not interested in protesting. I don't want to go around with hacked off hair and no makeup and sit around bashing men. I do think women should have the same kinds of rights, including equal pay for equal work, but I wouldn't call myself a feminist." End quote. It's important to remember that there are many ways to be a feminist and to realize that some of the stereotypes about feminism are rooted in sexism and homophobia, in that feminists are reduced to men haters and often presumed to be lesbians. The feminist movement also gave some momentum to the transgender rights movement. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and/or expression do not match the gender they were assigned by birth. Transgender people may or may not seek medical intervention like surgery or hormone treatments to help match their physiology with their gender identity. The term transgender includes other labels such as transsexual, transvestite, cross-dresser, and intersex, among others. Terms like hermaphrodite and she-male are not considered appropriate. As with other groups, it is best to allow someone to self-identify first and then honor their preferred label. If you are unsure of which pronouns to use when addressing someone, you can use gender-neutral language, or you can use the pronoun that matches with how they are presenting. If someone has long hair, makeup, and a dress on, but you think their biological sex is male due to other cues, it would be polite to address them with female pronouns, since that is the gender identity they are expressing. Gender as a cultural identity has implications for many aspects of our lives, including real-world contexts like education and work. Schools are primarily grounds for socialization, and the educational experience for males and females is different in many ways from preschool through college. Although not always intentional, schools tend to recreate the hierarchies and inequalities that exist in society. Given that we live in a patriarchal society, there are communicative elements present in school that support this. For example, teachers are more likely to call on and pay attention to boys in a classroom, giving them more feedback in the form of criticism, praise, and help. This sends an implicit message that boys are more worthy of attention and valuable than girls. Teachers are also more likely to lead girls to focus on feelings and appearance, and boys to focus on competition and achievement. The focus on appearance for girls can lead to anxieties about body image. Gender inequalities are also evident in the administrative structure of schools, which puts males in position of authority more than females. While females make up 75% of the educational workforce, only 22% of school superintendents and 8% of high school principals are women. Similar trends exist in colleges and universities, with women only accounting for 26% of full professors. These inequalities in schools correspond to larger inequalities in the general workforce. While there are more women in the workforce now than ever before, they still face a glass ceiling, which is a barrier for promotion to upper management. Many of my students have been surprised at the continuing pay gap that exists between men and women. In 2010, women earned about 77 cents to every dollar earned by men. To put this into perspective, the National Committee on Pay Equity started an event called Equal Pay Day. In 2011, Equal Pay Day was on April 11th. This signifies that for a woman to earn the same amount of money a man earned in a year, she would have to work more than 3 months extra until April 11th to make up for the difference. I just have to say as an aside, that data may be very inaccurate, because if a man and a woman work the same number of hours at the same job and have the same level of seniority, then they should make the same amount of money. But if men work more hours or women work more hours or they have more seniority, the person who usually works more hours and gets more seniority should earn the most money. So those data may not account for the fact that men oftentimes give up their personal lives, their recreational lives, and even their family to identify themselves by their work and invest themselves in work in order to increase their identity around money and labels, whereas many females decide that they would rather work less hours and give less to the job and more to their family or more to their personal or social life. So I'm not sure that that data has actually borne out. So at the end of a year, whoever earns more money should be measured against the number of hours, their level of seniority, their level of overtime, and other things. That 77 cents to the dollar thing may not actually bear out if you scrutinize the data. Sexuality. While race and gender are two of the first things we notice about others, sexuality is often something we view as personal and private. Although many people hold a view that a person's sexuality should be kept private, this isn't a reality for our society. One only needs to observe popular culture and media for a short time to see that sexuality permeates much of our public disclosure. Sexuality relates to culture and identity in important ways that extend beyond sexual orientation, just as race is more than the color of one's skin, and gender is more than one's biological and physiological manifestations of masculinity and femininity. Sexuality isn't just physical, it is social in that we communicate with others about sexuality. Sexuality is also biological, in that it connects to physiological functions that carry significant social and political meaning, like puberty, menstruation, and pregnancy. Sexuality connects to public health issues like sexually transmitted infections, sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and teen pregnancy. Sexuality is at the center of political issues like abortion, sex education, and gay and lesbian rights. While all these contribute to sexuality as a cultural identity, the focus in this section is on sexual orientation. The most obvious way sexuality relates to identity is through sexual orientation. Sexual orientation refers to a person's primary physical and emotional sexual attraction and activity. The terms we most often use to categorize sexual orientation are heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. Gays, lesbians, and bisexuals are sometimes referred to as sexual minorities. While the term sexual preference has been used previously, sexual orientation is more appropriate since preference implies a simple choice. Although someone's preference for a restaurant or actor may change frequently, sexuality is not as simple. The term homosexual can be appropriate in some instances, but it carries with it a clinical and medicalized tone. As you will see in the timeline that follows, the medical community has a recent history of treating homosexuality with means that most would view as inhumane today. So many people prefer a term like gay, which was chosen and embraced by gay people, rather than homosexual, which was imposed by a then discriminatory medical system. The gay and lesbian rights movement became widely recognizable in the United States in the 1950s and continues on today, as evidenced by prominent issues regarding sexual orientation in national news and politics. National and international groups like the Human Rights Campaign advocate for rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. While these communities are often grouped together within one acronym, GLBTQ, they are different. Gays and lesbians constitute the most visible of the groups and receive the most attention and funding. Bisexuals are rarely visible or included in popular cultural discourses or in social and political movements. Transgender issues have received much more attention in recent years, but transgender identity connects to gender more than it does to sexuality. Last, queer is a term used to describe a group that is diverse in terms of identities, but usually takes a more activist and at times radical stance that critiques sexual categories. While queer was long considered a derogatory label and still is by some, the queer activist movement that emerged in the 1980s and early 1990s reclaimed the word and embraced it as a positive. As you can see, there is a diversity of identities among sexual minorities, just as there is a variation with races and genders. As with other cultural identities, notions of sexuality have been socially constructed in different ways throughout human history. Sexual orientation didn't come into being as an identity category until the late 1800s. Before that, sexuality was viewed in more physical or spiritual senses that were largely separate from a person's identity. Table 8.3, Developments Related to Sexuality, Identity, and Communication, traces some of the developments relevant to sexuality, identity, and communication that show how this cultural identity has been constructed over the past 3,000 years. I'm just checking to see because my battery's dying, and this chapter ends on page 402 and I'm on page 396. I gotta check my battery here. Okay, I'm good. All right, this is another chart, the years and the development. So this is saying 1400 BCE to 565. So 1400 BC, 565 BC. During the Greek and Roman era, there was no conception of sexual orientation as an identity. However, sexual relationships between men were accepted for some members of society. Also at this time, Greek poet Sappho wrote about love between women. 533, so this is going to be 533 AD. Byzantine Emperor Justinian makes adultery and same-sexual acts punishable by death. 1533, civil law in England indicates the death penalty can be given for same-sex sexual acts between men. 1810, Napoleonic Code in France removes all penalties for any sexual activity between consenting adults. 1861, England removes death penalty for same-sex sexual acts. 1892, the term heterosexuality is coined to refer a form of sexual. I gotta read that again. Some of this is new to me, so it's stuff I haven't studied before. 1892, the term heterosexuality is coined to refer, I think it means to refer to a form of sexual perversion in which people engage in sexual acts for reasons other than reproduction. Okay. 1897, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld founds the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in Berlin. It is the first gay rights organization. 1900 to 1930, doctors treat homosexuality with castration electroshock therapy, and incarceration in mental hospitals. That happens to be true, and I have studied some of that. 1924, the first gay rights organizations in the United States, the Chicago Society for Human Rights, is founded. 1933 to 44, tens of thousands of gay men are sent to concentration camps under Nazi rule. The prisoners are forced to wear pink triangles on their uniforms. The pink triangle was later reclaimed as a symbol of gay rights. 1934, the terms heterosexuality and homosexuality appear in Webster's dictionary with generally the same meaning the term holds today. 1948, American sexologist Alfred Kinsey's research reveals that more people than thought have engaged in same-sexual sex activity. His research highlights the existence of bisexuality. Indeed, it does. I've actually read Alfred Kinsey's books in their original first edition, the Male Report and the Female Report. 1969, on June 27th, patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York City fight back as police raid the bar, a common practice used by police at the time to harass gay people. And the Stonewall riot, as it came to be called, was led by gay, lesbian, and transgender patrons of the bar, many of whom were working class and/or people of color. 1974, the American Psychiatric Association removes its reference to homosexuality as a mental illness. I think that was in the version of the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, version 3. And that was a very strong political move organized by a group that actually, I believe, started in Sacramento, California. I've met some people who were part of that movement to get that started and actually sat in the restaurant where the plans to remove that label were started. 1999, the Vermont Supreme Court rules that the state must provide legal rights to same-sex couples. In 2000, Vermont became the first state to offer same-sex couples civil unions. 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that Texas's sodomy law is unconstitutional, which effectively decriminalizes consensual same-sex relations. 2011, the U.S. military policy Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly. By the way, a lot of Alfred Kinsey's research has been found to be bogus. And if you want to know more about Alfred Kinsey, there's a scholar named Judith Reisman who did quite a bit of study. I believe she wrote a book called Kinsey, Sex, and Fraud. And he did some really unethical research on children, including infants. And Alfred Kinsey is not how he's portrayed in the media. Ability. There is resistance to classifying ability as a cultural identity because we follow a medical model of disability that places disability as an individual and medical rather than social and cultural issue. While much of what distinguishes able-bodied and cognitively able from disabled is rooted in science, biology, and physiology, there are important socio-cultural dimensions. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. An impairment is defined as any temporary or permanent loss of or abnormality of a body structure or function, whether physiological or psychological. This definition is important because it notes the social aspect of disability in that people's life activities are limited, and the relational aspect of disability in that the perception of a disability by others can lead someone to be classified as such. Ascribing an identity of disabled to a person can be problematic. If there is a mental or physical impairment, it should be diagnosed by a credentialed expert. If there isn't an impairment, then the label of disabled can have negative impacts, as this label carries social and cultural significance. People are tracked into various educational programs based on their physical and cognitive abilities, and there are many cases of people being mistakenly labeled disabled who were treated differently despite their protest of the ascribed label. Students who did not speak English as a first language, for example, and perhaps still are, sometimes put into special education classes. Ability, just as the other cultural identities discussed, has institutionalized privileges and disadvantages associated with it. Ableism is the system of beliefs and practices that produces a physical and mental standard that is projected as normal for a human being and labels deviations from it abnormal, resulting in unequal treatment and access to resources. Ability privilege refers to the unearned advantages that are provided for people who fit the cognitive and physical norms. I once attended a workshop about ability privilege led by a man who was visually impaired. He talked about how, unlike other cultural identities that are typically stable over a lifetime, ability fluctuates for most people. We have all experienced times when we are more or less able. Perhaps you broke your leg and had to use crutches or a wheelchair for a while. Getting sick for a prolonged period of time also lessens our abilities, but we may fully recover from any of these examples and regain our ability privilege. Whether you've experienced a short-term disability or not, the majority of us will become less physically and cognitively able as we get older. Statistically, people with disabilities make up the largest minority group in the United States, with an estimated 20% of people 5 years or older living with some form of disability. Medical advances have allowed some people with disabilities to live longer and more active lives than before, which has led to an increase in the number of people with disabilities. This number could continue to increase as we have thousands of veterans returning from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with physical disabilities or psychological impairments such as post-traumatic stress disorder. As disability has been constructed in U.S. history, it has intersected with other cultural identities. For example, people opposed to political and social equality for women cited their supposed physical, intellectual, and psychological flaws, deficits, and deviations from the male norm. They framed women as emotional, irrational, and unstable, which was used to put them into the scientific category of feeble-mindedness, which led them to be institutionalized. As another aside, up until about the year 1970 or so, you had to have a legal reason for divorce. Maybe it was 72. And then after that, you had no-fault divorce. You didn't have to have a reason to get divorced, just irreconcilable differences. And previous to sometime in the 1960s, a husband in the United States and many states could actually have his wife institutionalized by simply saying she was feeble-minded or crazy and signing a form to put her in an institution. Arguments supporting racial inequality and tighter immigration restrictions also drew on notions of disability, framing certain racial groups as prone to mental retardation, mental illness, or uncontrollable emotions and actions. See Table 8.4, Developments Related to Ability, Identity, and Communication for a timeline of developments related to ability, identity, and communication. I think I just read that over again. Let's start. See Table 8.4, Developments Related to Ability, Identity, and Communication for a timeline of developments related to ability, identity, and communication. It is what it said. These thoughts led to a dark time in U.S. history as the eugenics movement sought to limit reproduction of people deemed as deficient. Again, if you don't know what the term eugenics means, EUGENICS, it basically was the beginning of the so-called birth control movement. And this actually goes back to Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood, where they were trying to sterilize minorities, sterilize black people, and prevent them from having babies, and so-called feeble-minded people. That's a very racist history of Planned Parenthood, and the eugenics movement in the history of the United States did some really horrible things. Years and development. Here's a chart. 400 BCE, the Greeks make connections between biology, physiology, and actions. For example, they make a connection between epilepsy and a disorder of the mind, but still consider the source to be supernatural or divine. 30 to 480, people with disabilities are viewed with pity by early Christians and thought to be so conditioned because of an impurity that could possibly be addressed through prayer. 500 to 1500, as beliefs in the supernatural increased during the Middle Ages, people with disabilities are seen as manifestations of evil and are ridiculed and persecuted. 1650 to 1789, during the Enlightenment, the first large-scale movements toward the medical model are made as science and medicine advance and society turns to a view of human rationality. 1900s, the eugenics movement in the United States begins. And eugenics is basically what was called birth control. They actually wanted to issue licenses to people who could not have children and would be forced sterilized if they weren't the norm or the model. Laws are passed to sterilize the socially inadequate, and during this time, more than 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in 33 states. 1930s, people with disabilities become the first targets of experimentation and mass execution by the Nazis. A lot of you may not realize this because you're young, but the Nazis was a movement in Germany, and that's where Hitler came to power, and the connections between the eugenics movement in the United States and in Germany was very close. 1970s, the independent living movement becomes a prominent part of the disability rights movement. And if you want to look up the term LRE, least restrictive environment, the disability rights movement has a lot to do with LRE, which is least restrictive environment, and their civil rights. 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act is passed through Congress and signed into law. I believe that was the George Bush administration, though I'm not 100% sure. During the early part of the 1900s, the eugenics movement was the epitome of the move to rehabilitate or reject people with disabilities. This was a brand of social engineering that was indicative of a strong public support in the rationality of science to cure society's problems. A sterilization law written in 1914 proposed to authorize sterilization of the socially inadequate, which included the feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent. During the eugenics movement in the United States, more than 60,000 people in 33 states were involuntarily sterilized. Although the eugenics movement, as it was envisioned and enacted then, is unthinkable today, some who have studied the eugenics movement of the early 1900s have issued warnings that a newly packaged version of eugenics could be upon us. As human genome mapping and DNA manipulation become more accessible, advanced genetic testing could enable parents to eliminate so-called undesirable aspects or enhance so-called desirable characteristics of their children before they are born, creating designer children. That's pretty much already happening because you're forced, for the most part, to get an amniocentesis, and children are considered to have genetic defects, are oftentimes aborted before they're born. So this is already happening, but the manipulation of the DNA is a whole nother level, and that's going on also. Much has changed for people with disabilities in the United States in the past 50 years. The independent living movement, ILM, was a part of the disability rights movement that took shape along with the other social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. The independent living movement calls for more individual and collective action towards social change by people with disabilities. Some of the goals of independent living include reframing disability as a social and political rather than just a medical issue, a shift toward changing society rather than just rehabilitating people with disabilities, a view of accommodations as civil rights rather than charity, and more involvement by people with disabilities in the formulation and execution of policies relating to them. As society better adapts to people with disabilities, there will be more instances of inter-ability communication taking place. Inter-ability communication is communication between people with differing ability levels. For example, a hearing person communicating with someone who is hearing impaired, or a person who doesn't use a wheelchair communicating with someone who uses a wheelchair. Since many people are unsure of how to communicate with a person with disabilities, following are the 10 commandments of etiquette for communicating with people with disabilities to help you in communicating with persons with disabilities. Number 1, when talking to a person with a disability, speak directly to that person rather than through a companion or sign language interpreter. When introduced to a person with a disability, it is appropriate, this is number 2, it is appropriate to offer to shake hands. People with limited hand use or an artificial limb can usually shake hands. Shaking hands with the left hand is an acceptable greeting. In fact, shaking hands with the left hand is common in Native American culture because it's closer to your heart. Number 3, when meeting a person who is visually impaired, always identify yourself and others who may be with you. When conversing in a group, remember to identify the person to whom you are speaking. If you offer assistance, wait until the offer is accepted. Then listen to or ask for instructions. Number 5, treat adults as adults. Address people who have disabilities by their first names only when extending the same familiarity to others. Never patronize people who use wheelchairs by patting them on the head or shoulder. Number 6, leaning on or hanging on to a person's wheelchair is similar to leaning or hanging on to a person and is generally considered annoying. The chair is part of the personal body space of the person who uses it. Number 7, listen attentively when you're talking with the person who has difficulty speaking. Be patient and wait for the person to finish rather than correcting or speaking for the person. If necessary, ask short questions that require short answers, a nod, or a shake of the head. Never pretend to understand if you are having difficulty doing so. Instead, repeat what you have understood and allow the person to respond. The response will cue you in and guide your understanding. Number 8, when speaking with the person who uses a wheelchair or a person who uses crutches, place yourself at eye level in front of the person to facilitate the conversation. I'm not sure that's actually a good one. I just have to say I'm not sure that would be respectful to the person. They may or may not want that. You should ask. Number 9, to get the attention of a person who is deaf, tap the person on the shoulder or wave your hand. Look directly at the person and speak clearly, slowly, and expressively to determine if the person can read your lips. Not all people who are deaf can read lips. I have terrible hearing, and boy, I've been reading lips since I was a young kid. And it's really difficult on us because people say things to us and we don't hear. They think that we hear, they think we're ignoring them, and sometimes they can be very angry at us because they think we're simply not paying attention or not listening. For those who do read lips, be sensitive to their needs by placing yourself so that you face the light source and keep your hands, cigarettes, and food away from your mouth when speaking. 10. Relax. Don't be embarrassed if you happen to use accepted common expressions such as "see you later" or "did you hear about that" that seem to relate to a person's disability. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you're unsure of what to do. Gotta check my battery again. Yeah, it's at 4%. Key takeaways. The social constructionist view of culture and identity states that the self is formed through our interactions with others and in relation to social, cultural, and political contexts. Race, gender, sexuality, and ability are socially constructed cultural identities that developed over time in relation to historical, social, and political contexts. Race, gender, sexuality, and ability are cultural identities that affect our communication and our relationships. And there's 4 exercises. 1, do you ever have difficulty discussing different cultural identities due to terminology? If so, what are your uncertainties? What did you learn in this chapter that can help you overcome them? Number 2, what comes to mind when you hear the word feminist? How did you come to have the ideas you have about feminism? Number 3, how do you see sexuality connect to identity in the media? Why do you think the media portrays sexuality and identity the way it does? Number 4, think of an instance in which you had an interaction with someone with a disability. Would knowing the 10 Commandments for communicating with people with disabilities have influenced how you communicated in this instance? Why or why not? And that is the end of the chapter. Thank you. Please be sure and leave a comment if you actually use this. I'd like to see if anyone's using this. As I said when I first started this back in chapter 1, I'm doing this for someone I know who's taking this class and hoping that the read-along helps because they can read along and listen, or they can just listen to the book instead of actually reading it. And I'd appreciate any comments about whether or not this is helpful. Thank you.